Hi, I'm Josh Knobe from Cognitive Science at Yale.
Hi, I'm Ara Norenzayan in psychology at the University of British Columbia.
Hey, so Ara, I think that one thing that's been really interesting in a lot of your recent work is the studies you've been doing about atheism. And in particular, I've been really struck by your work about the kind of prejudices that people have about atheism. So we often hear about how people are prejudiced against, say, African Americans or against people who are gay, but there hasn't been too much work on the prejudice people have against people who are atheists. But what did you end up discovering about it?
Hi, Josh. This work I got into this work in recent years primarily because actually my graduate students pushed me into it. This work has been done primarily by Will Gervais, who's now at the University of Kentucky as an assistant professor, and Azim Sharif has been involved in it as well. We were intrigued about anti-atheist prejudice because we were studying the religion and prosociality, and we wondered whether or not that would lead to distrust of atheists. And then we discovered that there's so little known about this topic. As you said, so much we know a lot about racial prejudice, for example, in social psychology, my home field. There's a lot about, to lesser extent, but still considerable amount we know about ethnic prejudice, prejudice based on gender, but very, very little on anti-atheist prejudice. And this is, in a way, surprising because atheists, where there are religious majorities, atheists are not numerous. Mm-hmm. They're not that cohesive. Like Ricky Gervais said, the comedian Ricky Gervais said, atheism is a worldview, like not skiing is a hobby.
That's awesome. I wonder if Will Gervais got into this topic just because of his similarity of his name to Ricky Gervais.
I wonder about that too. I asked him about that, but this is pure coincidence. So unlike there's this, of course, unlike this small vocal minority of atheists who are quite vocal about their critique of religion or criticism of religion, most atheists are not like that, as far as we can tell. They just don't believe in something, right? They just an absence of belief as far as they're concerned. So we were puzzled. Why would a group of individuals who don't see themselves as a group, they're not that numerous in places where there is this prejudice, and they're not that cohesive, why would there be such rampant prejudice? Why not simply ignore atheists? Why would religious people simply just not care about atheists?
And so what's the answer? What is the prejudice people have against atheists?
So I think we have some answers now, and there's still some unanswered questions, but we find that anti-atheist prejudice is kind of peculiar, and it doesn't seem to fit the profile of other prejudices, ethnic or racial, for example. So it doesn't seem to be just about xenophobia or just wariness of outsiders, or it's not really about necessarily or only about conventional mechanisms that social psychologists study, like in-group, out-group mechanisms. I'm sure these are all part of what's going on, but we find that a critical piece of the puzzle about that has to do with the anti-atheist prejudice seems to be about distrusting them, because basically believers see atheists as moral wildcards. They just can't see how they could trust atheists if atheists don't think that there's a divine being or beings that are watching them 24/7.
It's so funny. So people have this thought that unless someone is going to cast you into the hellfires if you don't do the morally right thing, then why would you even do the morally right thing?
That's a very strong intuition among believers, that there's a necessary connection between morality and religion. In particular, this intuition that to be nice, to be good, you have to fear God. And if there's no fear of God, what would stop people from being mass murderers? This intuition, by the way, has a long history and goes way back into the Western tradition. You see it in John Locke. You see it in even in Enlightenment figures like Benjamin Franklin. Many of them have expressed this view that, look, I don't believe in this thing necessarily, but we have to have belief in the world, otherwise it will be mayhem.
Yes, so that's an interesting question. So you've talked about anti-atheist prejudice among believers, but what about among atheists? So
Yeah,
the atheists think that the theists are more trustworthy than the other atheists.
So that's a good question, right? Do atheists trust themselves? Is the question.
Yeah.
Only atheists would ask this question.
And then how does it turn out?
So we have some preliminary findings on this. Like I said, there's still this research is in infancy, but Will Gervais and Azim Sharif and I in the studies that we've done, we did look specifically at this question. We looked to see if atheists, what would atheists, how much atheists would trust other atheists. We clearly saw that a strong pattern where believers don't trust atheists and strongly trust other believers. For atheists, we found generally indifference. So it's not necessarily the case that atheists selectively prefer to trust atheists. Most atheists simply don't care about religion. They just don't think that religion is a relevant dimension on which you should base your judgments of people on.
That's actually a really interesting thing about anti-atheist prejudice is that other victims of prejudice are probably aware that people have a prejudice against them. People who are very old or who are obese, people who are gay, people who are African American. It's not that they wouldn't be shocked to discover that experimental studies reveal that they're prejudiced against them. But I wonder if atheists...
You wouldn't be shocked for African Americans to discover that research shows that there's prejudice against African Americans.
Right. African Americans, if we told them, guess what? With our sophisticated experimental techniques, we've discovered there's prejudice against African Americans. They wouldn't be blown away by our discovery. But do you think atheists maybe would? That they just have no idea that people are prejudiced against them?
That's an interesting question, and we haven't asked this question to atheists how much they're aware of prejudice around them. Although, just our conversations with many people, we find that people are often surprised at the extent of the prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
One of the issues I think is that, unlike, for instance, racial prejudice, prejudice against atheists atheism is a if you want to call it a stigma, from the perspective of the majority of believers, it's a concealable stigma,
mm-hmm.
right? So you can hide, especially if you're living in a very strongly religious society, and you worry about being punished or being the receiving end of a lot of negative behaviors. You're not going to go out there and say, I'm an atheist, right? So in a pernicious way, that could perpetuate the prejudice itself.
Oh, because people are never brought face to face with trustworthy people who are atheists.
Yeah.
Because they always just assume that whoever's trustworthy actually wasn't an atheist.
Also, people don't necessarily discuss the prejudice openly, and they're not confronted with the prejudice as much. In some ways, it's like anti-gay prejudice, right?
I wonder about the difference between those two. Probably a lot of people who are prejudiced against gay people or against old people, for example, aren't even aware of their own prejudice, and if you ask them about it, they would deny it. But I wonder with anti-atheist prejudice if the opposite could happen.
Totally opposite. It's really interesting. It's one of these few remaining prejudices where people openly express it. So, and people are sometimes surprised that we would call it prejudice. So it's a little bit like studying racial prejudice in the 1950s, right, in America. In majority religious societies, believers find it self-evident that you can't trust atheists. So there's nothing to hide.
I wonder if you can
norms,
get the
social
reverse
norms don't exist. We don't have social norms that say it's bad to say that atheists are untrustworthy.
I wonder if you can even get the reverse kind of case where certain people, if you ask them, they'd say, oh, it's very important not to trust the atheists, they're very bad. But then if you actually looked carefully at their behavior, you show that they're not prejudiced at all. They just think they should be.
Yeah, so is that the case in here? I doubt it because, it's a hard question because in majority religious societies, atheists don't come out. As a result, you don't find and so it's hard to know who's an atheist in these societies. Mm-hmm. As a result, you don't have as many documented cases of anti-atheist prejudice as you would find, for example, for racial or ethnic prejudice, simply because atheists are hiding, right? If you're in Iran or in Pakistan, in places where it's considered apostasy and you can be punished, like there could be even the death penalty for saying I'm an atheist. So it becomes really hard to study anti-atheist prejudice, understand how much of it is in people's minds, how much of it is real when it's a hidden prejudice. Now, having said that, in our studies that were led by Will, we do have implicit measures, not just asking people, do you trust atheists, but we get at this question in a more indirect way.
Mm-hmm.
We ask them, we have people do the IAT, the implicit association test, which is one implicit measure where we see how easily and intuitively people associate atheism or synonyms of atheism with words like trust, trust, honest, things like that. And we find a strong effect among, and this effect is predicted by believing, how much people believe in God. We also have other indirect measures where we ask people to solve reasoning problems, what they think are reasoning problems, but they're really measures of stereotyping of atheists. And we find, again, very strong effects of religiosity, religious belief on distrust of atheists.
So I wonder if you could construct a reasoning problem that worked in the direction where those people who weren't prejudiced against atheists would get the wrong answer, but it would only be the prejudice against atheists that would enable people to get the right answer.
Can you say more about that?
I wonder, so well, tell me, what's the problem that you actually used?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So one problem that Will Gervais came up with, which I thought was a very interesting way of studying stereotypes and prejudices, was to use this so-called Linda problem from the work of Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. So for people who, this is a famous one for us psychologists. It's used a lot in textbooks. So imagine you read a scenario about Linda. Linda is a prototypical feminist, so she cares deeply about women's rights. She participates in anti-nuclear demonstrations, things like that. They're associated with feminism. And then you ask people, which is more likely, which is more probable, that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist? Of course, in this description, you don't say that Linda is a feminist, just a description. And then you find that most people make this reasoning error. It's called the conjunction fallacy, where they say it's more likely that Linda is a bank teller and a feminist, even though that can't be true, right? Conjunction can't be more probable than the probability of an event that is part of the conjunction. So the correct answer is bank teller. But it's counterintuitive. It can't counter-stereotypic. So we use the scenarios like that, but instead of Linda being a bank teller or a feminist, we basically constructed the typical stereotype of the typical free rider, someone who commits insurance fraud, for example. Then we ask people, we call this person Richard. So do you think Richard is a teacher, or do you think Richard is a teacher and an atheist?
Oh,
right. So now we have basically one answer. The incorrect answer is the stereotypical answer. And we found that atheists didn't make this mistake. So if you don't believe in God, you don't fall into this error. But the stronger the belief in God of the participants, the more likely they thought that Richard is a teacher and an atheist. This wasn't true for we had a number of controls. So, for example, if you replaced atheist with Christian or Jewish or feminist or any other group, we use many different groups. You don't see this error.
Oh, so Christians don't think, I don't know, that Jewish people are untrustworthy, or that Muslims are untrustworthy. They think that atheists are untrustworthy.
Yeah, so this also raises the interesting question about to what extent this prejudice is something about atheism or something about just being religious outgroups. Because one could argue that atheists are a religious outgroup. But what we find is that in our studies, and also a lot of sociological evidence, that actually believers of a given religion, say Christians in America, would rather, they of course trust most their own group, but they would much rather trust a religious outgroup than an atheist. So a Christian would rather trust a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu than an atheist. Atheists are at the bottom.
Oh, no. I won't reveal on
Yes, you have to be careful. No, actually,
religious-
I mean, the revealing thing is also interesting. So, this is not, I wasn't part of this work, but Will Gervais also had done some series of studies where he finds that the more people think atheists are common, the less they are prejudiced against them.
Oh, right, because
So-
you know that it's not as though there's rampant free writing.
Yeah, I mean,
so if there's
there
rampant
might be
atheism-
different explanations for this, but it could be part of what's going on is that the more you think that there are atheists around you, the more you think, well, the world is not going to hell if there are lots of atheists in the world. It must be, maybe it's not that bad.
Oh, right.
So he tried this in different ways, just correlationally. The more you think, the more common you think atheists are, the less prejudice you are towards them. But also, if you make people think, you just lead people think that atheists are common, they're less prejudiced. If you lead people think that atheists are rare, they're more prejudiced.
So we need something like, this tradition of outing gay people. We need that for atheists.
I mean, Richard Dawkins has talked about that.
Oh, no. We
He's,
should not do that.
he's used the analogy of the gay liberation movement, saying, just like gays have been coming out, and that has made a big difference for gay liberation or gay rights. One could do the same thing if you're an atheist, and I think he's right about that. I think that part of the problem, it's not the only reason or only explanation for why anti-atheist prejudice has remained stable, even though other prejudices have declined. I think part of it is that atheists don't come out as much as other groups come out, like gays.
Wait, but let's now turn to the other side. So one thing that you've been seeing is that people, if they hear that you are an atheist, they think that you're less trustworthy. But then, obviously, the converse of that is that if they hear that you're religious, then they see you as more trustworthy.
Right.
So do you see that as playing some really important role in our society as well? So almost everyone in our society, the vast majority of people, are religious believers. And then that is sort of, according to this kind of view, the fact that they're religious believers is making everyone see them as more trustworthy. It seems like it could have potentially a really important impact on the whole way society functions.
For sure, and that's what you find. There are some economic game studies showing also that believers would, in trust games where you have the option of transferring money to someone who can then to return the money with a greater amount. So then the question is, how much do you trust someone to do that? So everybody wins. Believers selectively trust believers. But again, you don't find the reverse. It's not like atheists selectively trust atheists.
So everyone, it's sort of optimal just if everyone would, regardless of what everyone actually is, if everyone could convince others that they were believers, our society would be a lot better off. But maybe if everyone
not necessarily, because there are other mechanisms for trust, right? Obviously, we see that in societies where there are strong secular institutions. So, I mean, historically, I would argue that religion has been an important mechanism, a crucial mechanism to build trust, especially when you have anonymity in large-scale groups. This is a topic of the book that I recently finished. So historically, when there were no secular alternatives to religion, you don't have reliable courts, you don't have reliable police. You can't just call the police if someone's trying to cheat you or harm you. And so as societies scale up and people have to interact with anonymous strangers, watchful gods were the only game in town. But over the last few hundred years, we've had strong alternatives to religion in secular societies where people can trust each other for other reasons, right? For when you have strong, reliable institutions.
But so how can you, starting with the earlier time, you were seeing in this earlier time when there weren't strong, reliable institutions, the only way that we could trust each other is by having these watchful gods. So how can we know whether that was true? How can we, looking backwards at this earlier time, or at other societies now, how can we figure out whether the watchful gods were playing this role?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's I spend a lot of time sorting out the evidence on this. A lot of this historical data, some of it we can extrapolate from cross-cultural data from societies now. One interesting finding, from the ethnographic record, is, for example, is that as you find an interesting association between the scaling of societies, how large-scale societies are, and the prevalence of these kinds of big watchful gods. So the more likely you have large societies where anonymity is a typical issue, the more likely these societies have watchful gods who are omniscient, who are interventionists. They care about people's lives and they intervene, they punish, they reward. Whereas in smaller scale societies, and if you go all the way, back to foraging societies, you find that in the supernatural pantheon of these societies, there's a mixed bag of things, of beliefs. Some of them can be moral in a limited sense, or omniscient in a limited sense, but the typical local god of a hunting and foraging society, hunting and gathering society, is not a moral god.
Oh, so they're these supernatural beings, and they care about something, but they don't care about whether we are trustworthy or treat each other okay.
Yeah, and this is this comes as a surprise for those of us who are so steeped in the Abrahamic tradition, right? We take it for granted that morality and religion go together. At least this is how religious people think about it. God is an omniscient watcher who cares about what people do. He cares about if you cheat someone, or if you steal, or if you or conversely cooperate, etc. But this is my argument is that this is a historical process. It's a cultural evolutionary process where over time, as societies were scaling up, morality was increasingly tied to religion, but religion didn't start that way.
So with small societies come small gods, and with big societies you have big gods.
Basically.
But so in the small societies, the idea would be what did the gods care about? So they cared about whether we did something, but just not whether we were.
They care about whether or not you do conduct proper rituals. Oftentimes, these are meant for just satisfying the wishes and the needs of the god. So, did you do the proper sacrifices for the local gods?
But as for whether you cheat on your wife or stab your neighbor in the back, they're sort of indifferent as long as you do the ritual.
Typically, they tend to be indifferent. Some gods care in some ways. Sometimes they care about things that we don't consider moral issues. For example, what kind of food you eat or what kind of clothes you wear. So there are also interesting variability on what domains are considered, things that the gods care about. Whereas the big gods of the world religions, they consistently care about issues that we clearly would see as issues of cooperation and trust.
Oh, and so also the small gods it's not just that they don't care, it's that they don't even know, right? Like you're saying, their smallness is that they can't just be everywhere and see what you're doing. They don't even know what you're doing.
Sometimes they have very limited omniscience, and sometimes the gods can be fooled. So there are many ethnographic accounts like that, which again, for us, it's surprising, coming from the Abrahamic tradition where God is omniscient, He knows everything, He watches everyone 24/7. But give you an example from the field work of my colleague Joe Henrik, who does his field work in a small island in Fiji, the Asawa Islands. There, for example, the local god Kaluvu, he may know things that are happening within the village boundaries. So people, for some things, may care about what Kaluvu thinks within the village. But if you go to the main island, Kaluvu can't know and can't see.
So if you want to do something,
so you can go and cheat and steal in the main island and come back and be nice again, and you're okay, right? That's very
so he
counterintuitive
cares
for
about
us.
morality, but only in the part of the world that he can see. If you want to do something immoral, you just have to go away.
Yeah, so I think that this idea that extending the moral concern and the omniscience of gods to the absolute was a cultural process. That's my argument, at least, and that you don't find it in most foraging societies. You find some intermediate degrees of moral concern and omniscience in other societies, like chieftain societies, and the point being that, this was a partial solution to anonymity issues in large-scale societies.
Wait, so is this suggestion that if there were different groups, some of whom had gods that cared about whether they cooperated with each other, and some of whom had gods who didn't care whether they cooperated with each other, the ones with the gods who cared about cooperation would cooperate more, and then they would sort of crush and defeat the people who had these other gods, so that eventually there's no one who believes in the other gods?
That's part of, I think, what probably went on historically. So there's an intergroup competition element in this. So societies that were stumbled on this idea of a more omniscient and watchful gods and moral gods, they probably cooperated and trusted more, which led to an expansion of these societies, which in turn led to the spread of these beliefs, right? So this also could help us understand why this other puzzle that has interested me in the last few years, which is this interesting question of why is it that even though there are thousands of religions in the world, if you just count religions, but only a few religions account for a disproportionately large percentage of humanity. So just Islam, Christianity put together, you already have more than half of the world's population. Right? So there's an interesting puzzle to explain here, and so I think that this possibly could solve this additional problem too, which is that as cooperative societies expand, either by demographic expansion or by conquest in other cases, by conversions, of course, obviously, you get these beliefs spreading, and at the account of other beliefs that didn't do as well.
But is it actually true that believers cooperate more? I mean, there's this sort of stereotype, at least among certain circles, of the person who seems very devout and works as a televangelist, but then you just find him doing meth with prostitutes or something.
Yeah, and my argument is that actually this it's a complex question, and I think that the answer is there's no simple answer to this question, and there are reasons for that. I don't think that there's a wholesale effect of religion on cooperation. I think that the effect of religion on cooperation are very situational specific and contextually specific.
Oh, meaning you only cooperate more if someone's talking about religion in that exact situation that you're in.
I think
there has to be a cross on the wall right there. Or something.
Yeah, so and this is not a surprise for those of us who are social psychologists, that the religious situation is more powerful than the religious disposition. This is true also in many other domains of human behavior. So in our studies, we find that reminders of these gods have a reliable effect on making people be more cooperative and less likely to cheat. But just asking people to self-report how religious you are, does that tell you how cooperative they will be? Not necessarily, especially not in societies where there are strong secular institutions, like in North America, for example, where you have high base rates of cooperation and trust to begin with. So in the societies, already you have strong institutions that have socialized individuals to be cooperative. So the signal from religion becomes much weaker, and the effect of religion is much more situational. So if you're in church or mosque or temple, whatever, you're going to be much more cooperative and more trusting than if you're in another situation. How much of a believer you are is not necessarily going to impact your behavior unless you're at the moment of making a decision about whether or not to cooperate or not. You will be thinking about a watchful God, right? So another way of saying this is that believers are not constantly thinking about God in their lives, right? They have lots of other concerns, and there are lots of competing beliefs and motivations that are relevant to their behavior.
So what about the atheists in the religious situations? Like, for example, suppose that you were an atheist, but your wife was religious, and just to kind of get along well with her, you decided to go to church every Sunday. Then would you be more cooperative and more trustworthy on Sundays, even though you don't believe anything that's happening, just because everyone's talking about God?
Yeah, so I don't know, Josh, if you know about the Sunday effects. There are these really clever studies.
About watching pornography or something?
I'm sorry?
there's this funny effect about watching pornography.
There's a pornography Sunday effect. There's also just a generosity Sunday effect. So there's this lovely study by Deepak Malhotra, who's at the Harvard Business School, where he had a large number of people who were contacted online and were asked to donate to charity, non-religious charities. And so these appeals were done on a regular basis over a period of several weeks, any given day. And then he had a large enough sample to look to see if Christians are more willing to respond to these charities than non-Christians, non-believers. And what he found was, on any given day of the week, there were no differences. So Christians or non-believers were no different in responding to these charity appeals. But on Sundays, Christians were 3 times more likely to respond.
Oh, so that means that the Christians have to be less likely to respond on every other day.
Well,
in order for it to have no main effect.
Yeah. So if you look at it's a bit complicated. If you look at the results, you also find that atheists were actually less likely to respond on Sundays.
Really?
Which is kind of interesting. And, so there might be interesting reasons for that. But I don't remember from that study that the Christians were less likely to donate. But if I'm remembering right, there were no differences. But in the other study that you were referring to, the pornography study, you do find that. So this was a study by Edelman, I believe his name is, economist, who was curious to know what explains or predicts online pornography usage in the U.S. So he did the state-by-state analysis. I don't think his main concern was religion, but he had that variable in terms of the state, religiosity levels of the state. So if you compare blue states to red states, you can get a rough measure of religiosity, right? Red states are much more religious than blue states. So the question is it true that red states, more religious states, are less likely to access online porn than blue states? The answer is no. On average, there's no effect. But then if you look more carefully, you find that on Sundays, there's a dip in online porn usage in red states. But then you get a reversal on other days of the week.
Oh no!
So once again, I think this is interesting and important, and this is something that a lot of people find it surprising about religion. People tend to think of religion as this absolute variable, as if you're religious, therefore everything you do, any given moment in your life, will influence your behavior. But that doesn't, of course, psychologically, that's not plausible, right? Like any other thing, any other motivation or belief system, it has to be on your mind, right, to have an influence on your behavior. So Sundays, obviously, for Christians, are days when people are thinking about their religious beliefs a lot.
Wait, so then the key question I was asking earlier, though, is, do we even need anyone to be a believer, or is it all a matter of being in religious situations? I mean, there are many people who are atheists, but for one reason or another go to services. They go because they want to be connected with people in their family, say their spouse who's religious, or they go just because they feel a certain kind of ethnic identity, like many Jewish people go to services on Friday because they feel sort of connected with Jewish culture, even though they don't actually believe in God.
Yeah.
But so then they're going to this place where everyone's talking about God, which they don't believe in.
Yeah.
But does just being surrounded by people talking about this thing you don't believe in, does that make you more trustworthy?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do you think?
I just think about it intuitively. I feel like that even on the atheists it would work. If you had things that made them think about God, even though they're not believing in God, that you would still get the same effect.
Yeah, so this also, this is a question about, this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And in our studies, when we do religious priming studies, we always are careful to look to see if the priming is how well the priming is working for atheists. And we get mixed results.
Oh.
Sometimes the priming works with atheists, but sometimes it doesn't. the priming typically reliably works with believers, for sure, but it doesn't always work with atheists, which has led me to wonder if there are different kinds of atheists, right? Some atheists might be much more, may have internalized religion at some level, and might still behave in this way, consistent with with religious beliefs, even if they're not explicitly believers themselves. Others may not be responsive at all.
Well, it maybe also comes back to the issue that you were talking about before, that some atheists just don't really think about religion either way. And then a certain minority of atheists maybe have an active belief that there is no God. So maybe it's much more likely that your manipulations would work on someone who isn't really, I don't know, focused on the idea that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, so it kind of makes sense. If you don't think that God is real, you prime people with God. It's like priming them with Santa Claus or Mickey Mouse. I mean, for them, it's a fictional character. So if they have that kind of association, the priming should not work. On the other hand, if there's some kind of internalized implicit association with God as being real, even if people explicitly override that intuition, you might still get the priming effect. So it's conceivable that there are these kinds of interesting differences among atheists that we are just starting to look into. But your question,
I could easily imagine that priming me with characters from Mad Men or something could have an impact on my behavior, just making me think about these characters. It's not that I think that Don Draper really exists. And in the same way, an atheist who thinks that God doesn't really exist, at least insofar as the atheist isn't actively thinking, the thought that this thing doesn't exist, even seeing it as a fictional character, the prime could still work.
It could. I mean, I think that's an open question that we don't have good answers yet.
But there's something that's now puzzling me about our conversation. So far we've been talking about all these advantages that religiosity brings to society, increases cooperation, and so forth. But given that all that is true, why are there atheists?
Yes, that's something that I've been thinking about. And there's this has a question, of course, is a big question that has occupied a lot of thinkers, the question of secularization, how it happens, why it happens, where does it happen. So I have some thoughts on that. We can talk about it if you like. But I just wanted to also, just going back to your earlier point, I think you're making a very important point. I just want to say that there are many people who are not believers, but culturally would still consider themselves religious. So many American Jewish people are like that, right? They're kind of cultural Jews, so to speak, even though they might be atheists. And I myself, I grew up in the Armenian Orthodox Church, which is a little bit like the Jewish tradition. It's very participation-based. And people don't typically ask you what you believe, right? You could go to church in your entire life. Nobody will ask you, do you believe in God? Right? So there could be a lot of atheists who are participating in religious services just because of cultural reasons. Many Scandinavians are like that, right? They're cultural Christians. They like their baptisms, their weddings, their churches. But if you ask them, do you believe in God? They say no.
But it seems like there's some different... The Armenian Orthodox and the Jewish tradition, these are religions of descent in a way that the Scandinavian churches aren't.
Correct, yeah. That's well, maybe even the Scandinavian churches fit that pattern. I mean, I don't have to think about that, but for sure, at the Armenian case, you're Armenian Orthodox if your parents are Armenian Orthodox. Conversion is discouraged, and there's no interest on part of the church to proselytize in the similar way as the Jewish tradition doesn't proselytize. So it's a very different way of thinking about religion compared to, say, the Protestant approach, which is very strongly faith-based, right?
And this makes for a really nice, as it were, controlled study. So if you want to see what is the impact of religious belief, but you want to control for all other factors, then you can look at people who are the same in that they're both very religious, they're both very involved in the synagogue, they both obey all these religious laws, and the only difference is religious belief.
Yeah, and this also drives the point home that it's really crucial when we're thinking about religion to unpack it, right? We often think of religion as like a unitary thing. Like you ask people, are you religious? we assume that this dimension of religiosity, and the more you have it or the less you have it tells us where this person stands. But really, if you think at least from a psychological point of view, religion is just a package of solutions, right, that societies have stumbled on. And so there are different parts to religion, and we need to unpack these parts. So participation may have very different kinds of effects on people's behaviors than, say, their beliefs, or how much they think that some value is sacred, for example, right? These are different things.
So when we think about atheists, if we focus on the fact that they don't have religious beliefs, we might be focusing in a way on one of the least important parts of the package.
Well, I think that they're both important. I don't think it's one or the other. There has been lots of debates on this. People debate which one is more important. Practice is some people think ritual is incredibly important. I think it's very important as well. But belief is very important too. In particular, I think belief in these supernatural watchers, can be very important for certain kinds of things. So I don't think that it's one or the other. We don't have to choose. I think one of the interesting things about religion is that it's a package. It's a package of tendencies or solutions. And this package is a bit of a shape-shifting package. So different societies construct this package differently. Historically, this package evolves culturally, possibly genetically, we don't know. But even though this package goes together, it's an assembly that goes together, the parts may be doing different things. So we need to understand them for what they are.
So when you talked earlier about the idea that one of the most important things about the part of the package that involves being watched is this idea that it enables us to trust each other. But then it seems like right now our society has achieved this very strange kind of state where maybe we don't really need that as much. We have such powerful institutions involving, the government, the police, these other kinds of social institutions, that the kind of need for supernatural monitoring that we've had throughout almost all of our history is probably just much less necessary at this particular time than it would be in general.
Yeah, again, now we're back to the question of secularization. I think it's a great, fascinating question, and I know that there's quite a bit of literature on this in philosophy, in history, and in sociology. Interestingly, psychologists haven't said much about this. And and I think there are some really interesting questions that we can ask, psychologists can ask about the effects of the origins of secularization, but also the effects of secularization on human behavior. So I've been starting to think about this, and like you said, if as the saying goes, watch people are nice people. We know that people become much nicer when they're under surveillance. If people feel that they're being, they have to account for their behavior. So watchful gods have served that purpose for thousands of years in large-scale societies. But now we have an interesting social transition, it appears, in some places, certainly not everywhere. In fact, most of the world is still doesn't have any strong secular institutions. But in the West, in Northern Europe, in northern part of the American continent, we have strong secular institutions that seem to have basically take away the functions of religion in this way. And there's this interesting pattern that we find as societies develop stronger institutions, people start to trust these institutions. Levels of trust and cooperation go up for everyone, and then religiosity declines. You find this also historically. In the last 100 years, you find that as societies become more established in their institutions, you have also a parallel decline in religion.
So basically, you have to be watched, but it doesn't matter who you're being watched by. I mean, if you're being watched by the police, you don't have to be watched by God.
So I think that's a big part of the process. I don't want to say that that's the only reason why people are pro-social. Clearly not. I mean, there are other things that are going on as well. For example, we are also now in many societies are socialized to extend our empathy to strangers, right? I mean, typically empathy is rooted in evolution. From an evolutionary perspective, empathy, compassion is something about kin and reciprocating partners, perhaps friendships. Right? We naturally feel empathy towards family members. We naturally feel empathy towards friends, and as a result, empathy can produce cooperation and pro-social tendencies. But now interestingly, we can extend the moral circle, so to speak, and feel empathy towards complete strangers, or even other species, right? So that could be another important change in some societies. But I think that monitoring is also a very important part of the story here, where governments can monitor. If they do it really well, people feel like, if I feel like I can call the police and the police can come and help me protect my property or help me deal with a cheater, then I'm less likely to rely on religion for that.
But there's something kind of puzzling about this, because you mentioned that in small-scale societies, where there's no need for this kind of monitoring because of the smallness of scale, then people don't believe in monitoring gods, but they still believe in gods. They just believe in small gods who aren't monitoring them.
Yeah.
But we don't seem to be seeing that. It's not like as Scandinavian culture has developed stronger and stronger institutions, people have started believing in Kalavu. They've just stopped believing in God. So what's the difference?
There are many superstitions and paranormal beliefs in Scandinavian societies.
Really? There are more?
Yeah. In England, more than 50% of British people believe in ghosts. Apparently that number is higher than believing in God.
Wait, but is it more than in the cultures like the United States?
Sorry, say again?
So, if you consider the belief in these supernatural things like ghosts in, say, Scandinavia versus in a really religious culture like the United States, do you get more belief in ghosts in Scandinavia?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, but clearly there's large number of people who still have these kinds of beliefs and intuitions. But going back to your question, small-scale societies have supernatural beliefs. No question about that. I don't think that there have been any societies found where there are no supernatural beliefs. So I think in that sense, religion is universal. So clearly, from my perspective, the way I think about this is that the origin story for supernatural beliefs is a cognitive byproduct story, in the sense that our brains have the particular kind of structure that makes it really easy and intuitive to conceive of supernatural beings. And that can would account for the universality of these beliefs. But then, what particular kind of beings we believe in would be, to an important extent, a product of cultural evolution. So that some variants of these beliefs, for example, gods that monitor, intervene, etc., would be culturally selected and would spread at the expense of other kinds of beliefs. So that's one important kind of theoretical point that I think it's important to appreciate, that the prosocial effects of religion, I don't think I don't see it as an origin story for religion. I think that you have to start with cognitive biases. For example, intuitions about mind-body dualism that Paul Bloom has talked about, maybe intuitions of a teleology that many psychologists have written about, like Deb Kellerman. Our tendency to mentalize, think about mental states of other people. It's a small step from that to think of mental states as being disembodied, right? To go back to dualism. So all these tendencies, I think, push people towards religion, but what particular content they take can be very different in different cultures, and these contents can be very important in influencing what people do. So yeah.
So, we should wrap up soon, but it seems like we are in a situation right now where we have the opportunity for a really exciting new kind of social scientific experiment. As atheist societies become more and more entrenched, as people start growing up without being told anything about God, we have a chance to sort of learn something about the human mind that we wouldn't have been able to learn, a number of decades ago.
Yeah, I think this is a great time to do this research, and then now there's a resurgence of interest in religion from different disciplines, and I think one of the exciting things about this new developments is that now there is a bit of a convergence in looking at religion from an evolutionary perspective. just try to ask the question of how does religion fit in human nature, and where does it come from, and how does it fit into our evolutionary history? And religion is a complex thing, so there are different parts to it. It's a little bit like that story about the elephant and the 10 blind men. If 10 blind men touch an elephant from different parts, they see different things. So I think there's a little bit of a myopia in different fields, my field included. I mean, you look at religion from a psychological point of view, you might emphasize the belief component more, because in psychology we are used to studying belief. If you're an anthropologist, you see rituals more clearly. If you're, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's really crucial that people talk to each other across disciplines, because in the end we want to put the pieces of the puzzle together to have a complete picture.
So on that positive note, Ara Norenzayan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.